China and Russia boast a strategic partnership with no limits, but beneath the surface, China is quietly positioning itself to take what it really wants: Siberia. While Putin clings to this shaky alliance, hoping for more support in his war efforts, China's true goal is to weaken Russia and reclaim the vast, resource-rich lands of the Russian Far East. With the population dwindling and its economy battered by war, Russia is vulnerable, and China knows it. Siberia, with its untapped resources and strategic value, is the real prize. For Xi Jinping, this isn't just about economic advantage, it's about fulfilling China's long-term vision of global power, the Great Rejuvenation. How far will China go? To unpack that, we first need to look at what the Great Rejuvenation truly means and why Siberia is central to this ambitious plan. Like Putin, Xi is a revanchist leader. China's period of weakness in the 19th and early 20th centuries haunts him as much as the fall of the Soviet Union haunts Putin. China lost much of its prestige and a lot of its territory during that time, and that includes territory in what is today Russia. How did that happen? Russia expanded eastward starting in the 16th century. Its long occupation by the Mongols in the medieval period still haunted it, and it desired to gain suitable frontiers to prevent such an occurrence from happening again. As it went east, it eventually encountered the Qing dynasty, which held land in Siberia, including modern Vladivostok, which was then called Haishanwai. The expanding Russian presence toward the Amur River eventually led to a series of sieges of a fortress called Albazino in 1686 and 1687. The Qing won these battles, which resulted in the 1689 Treaty of Nechinsk. This agreement guaranteed the lands in the upper Amur Valley to China, containing Russia's expansion in the Far East. However, the treaty was written in Latin and translated into Russian and Manchu separately, resulting in inconsistencies and ambiguous borders. The treaty nevertheless held until the late 1850s. By then, things were different, and the Qing dynasty had weakened considerably. In 1858, the Russian Empire forced the Treaty of Aigun onto the Qing. It reversed Nechinsk and gave Russia all the land north of the Amur River. 2 years later, at the Convention of Peking, Russia added the rest of what is now called Outer Manchuria to its borders, including Vladivostok, cutting off China from the Sea of Japan. The Communist Party of China, and Xi in particular, have often spoken against the unequal treaties forced on China during its late Qing weakness. It's used these unequal treaties and unfair treatment as a basis for expansive territorial claims, most notably with Taiwan. The Qing once ruled this island, but was forced to surrender it to Japan in 1895 after its defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War. It was returned to the Republic of China after Japan's defeat in World War II, but the People's Republic has never ruled it. Taiwan's new president, Lai Ching-te, broached this subject in a recent interview. He said that China's intention to take over Taiwan was not for reasons of territorial integrity. If that were the case, he wondered why Beijing hasn't raised the issue of the Treaty of Aigun with Russia. After all, using the same logic, China's territorial claim on Taiwan would essentially be the same as raising a territorial claim against Russia. However, China has demonstrated a willingness to use multiple tools to achieve its foreign policy ends. It can feel more confident about bullying Taiwan. With Russia, things need to be a little more subtle. China has in fact raised the issue of lost territories in more recent history. It and the Soviet Union had a conflict over these lands in 1969. China lost the border war and only came back to negotiations in 1991. These negotiations continued in the 1990s and 2000s as China and Russia began to improve their relations in response to the United States' emergence as the world's so-called hyperpower. China and Russia agreed on the dual aim of creating a multipolar world order, but to cooperate on this, they needed to resolve their border issues. Fortunately for Beijing and Moscow, a 2008 agreement was supposed to have officially demarcated the border between the two countries. There was some minor tinkering, but the borders between Russia and China, as we know them, did not substantially change. That might have been good for the two governments on the surface, but many Chinese citizens continue to object, wanting a restoration of the lost lands. This was seen most notably in 2020, when the Russian embassy in China celebrated the founding of Vladivostok. Chinese social media users were quick to express their outrage, remembering the history that the Russian embassy was now celebrating. Beijing has been listening to its people's revanchist concerns about the Russian Far East, at least in part. In more recent years, China's mapmakers have subtly raised the territorial issue again. In 2023, the Ministry of Natural Resources in Beijing released a map that raised eyebrows. Vladivostok was called by its old Chinese name. Other locales in the contemporary Russian Far East were referred to by Chinese names too. Officially, such maps must accurately reflect the scope of China's territory. As such, the disputed islands in the South China Sea are also called Chinese territory, as is Taiwan. The message was simple: these lands were Chinese and part of Chinese territory. Although this was just a map, the regaining of these lost lands would be fully within the aims of a historical revanchist like Xi Jinping. China's salami-slicing strategy has long included these tactics. Conveniently, the publication of the new map came at the time it did, when Russia was weakened and increasingly dependent on the senior player in the strategic partnership. But there are other reasons why China would cast covetous eyes on its former territory. China is a comparatively resource-poor country. This resource scarcity has been exacerbated by decades of communist mismanagement. Even something as simple as water is proving a problem for the Chinese, with demand growing amid shortages, dwindling volume in rivers like the Yangtze, and pollution. As a result of its resource scarcity, China must import much of what it needs, and many of these imports come by way of maritime choke points that the United States Navy and Air Force can block off. Siberia, though, is rich with the natural resources it needs. There are 220 million hectares of arable land there that have not yet been exploited. China is comparatively lacking. It only has 7% of the world's arable land to feed its enormous population, and much of that arable land has been degraded due to poor management. The Russian Far East's agricultural potential is naturally inviting. But it's not just land. The lands in the Russian Far East that China once controlled have many other enticements. There are precious metals like gold and silver, important minerals like zinc and iron ore, timber, hydrocarbons, and other food resources like fish. And these are all beyond the US military's reach. China has tapped these resources in the partnership with Russia, although not always to the extent they would have wanted. For example, Chinese enterprises hope to use the water in Lake Baikal, which holds about 20% of the world's unfrozen freshwater. In 2019, the Chinese hoped to create a bottling plant to take some of this water, which sparked large protests. Locals accused the Chinese of wanting to ship the water to China to deprive them of access to the lake. A Russian court later halted the project. 2 years later, Chinese urban planners hoped to build a pipeline from Lake Baikal to the city of Lanzhou in an arid region of China. That project also never got off the ground. The controversy around the Lake Baikal investments gives the first clue about a potential conflict over these Far Eastern lands. The local Russians often didn't like the increasing Chinese presence in the area. Neither of the Lake Baikal plans came to fruition, in large part because of this distrust. However, China has an advantage in the great game of the region's resources: its demography. Russia's population will shrink from its present total of about 145 million to about 135 million by 2050. But this trend will hit the Russian Far East harder. This region has always been sparsely populated, and the fall of the Soviet Union made it even sparser as inhabitants moved west to Russia's European heartland seeking better opportunities. By 2050, there may only be about 5 million Russian nationals living in these far-flung territories. Across the river, there are 120 million Chinese. This has sparked nightmares on the Russian side of hordes of Chinese moving in and acquiring the territories through a huge tide of mass migration. These fears are partially related to ethnic biases. The Russians in the area typically view their Chinese counterparts with suspicion. International couples are uncommon. So far, the fears of a Chinese demographic takeover of the Russian Far East have proven misguided. In 2019, there were about 70,000 Chinese nationals living in the Russian Far East. This total actually declined from the high of about 200,000 in the 90s. Still, the Chinese have become an important presence in the Russian Far East economy, all with the encouragement of Beijing. Russian landowners have already widely leased farmland to Chinese nationals. Over 100,000 hectares have been rented out on 50-year leases. These plantations grow crops like soy that are then sent southwards. The Chinese nationals that work for Russian farmers in the area are also a welcome way for them to compensate for the shortage in native labor. Chinese nationals also often work in the timber industry and other Russian enterprises. For these Chinese workers, it's a welcome departure compared to the lack of opportunities in their rural and arid homelands. Moscow is aware of the native suspicion. It's made overtures of trying to strictly regulate the immigration of Chinese nationals into the Russian Far East as a way to placate these local concerns. One of the new requirements is that these foreign workers must pass a Russian language proficiency test before legally obtaining a temporary visa. However, Russian businesses often ignore the law with a wink and a nod from the local authorities. The local labor shortage means that the Chinese are the only convenient source to do the work that Russian businesses require. With Russian nationals either leaving for the West or being unwilling to do the work, these businesses feel like they have no other choice. For Russia, mitigating the population loss in Siberia is the only real way for it not to become dependent on Chinese labor and capital. Russia has in fact tried to benefit the inhabitants of the Far East with the new Ministry for the Far East. This ministry was created in 2011 with high hopes, but it squandered its resources on questionable projects, such as a bridge connecting Vladivostok to Russky Island. This $1.1 billion project resulted in the largest suspension bridge in the world. It's something of a local marvel. There's just one problem though. It's a bridge to nowhere and doesn't do much to benefit the hard-pressed locals. Why was such a money pit allowed to go forward? Well, since Russia's government is mainly based around enriching the people in it, it's lacking in long-term vision. Unsurprisingly, many of the funds allocated for regional development don't get to the Far East at all. They just line the pockets of the people that run the ministry. But what if this lack of support for the Far East is more of a feature than a bug? Russia's road network is also poor. This is a legacy of its imperial expansion. The road connects Vladivostok to Moscow, but not the Far Eastern regions with each other. It was a method designed to keep the population of Siberia subjugated and still has not changed. During Soviet times, there were various encouragements for people to move to the Far East, but those programs have dried up, and without any other support, it should not be surprising that many people have chosen to leave. Local companies that remain are often forced to maintain their own roads to get to their places of business. Many other enterprises that remain, particularly in the timber industry, are part of Putin's racket network, decreasing their competitiveness. In contrast, the Chinese have invested systematically in their region across the border, alleviating much of the poverty in the area and increasing its connectivity. Some of this connectivity moves beyond the national border. For example, China's phone network goes north of the Amur River. There are also many physical connections between China and the Russian Far East, with more on the way. There is a high-speed rail line that goes all the way to Beijing. This line has not received approval from Moscow, but it awaits extension in the region nevertheless. China also has an advantage in international financial markets. Because of the sanctions, Russian financing in the Far East often comes with interest rates of over 25%. Chinese financiers can lend money for interest rates of about 5%. Naturally, Russian businesses are more attracted to the Chinese money. There's even a dedicated forum for Russian businesses in Siberia seeking Chinese investment. It's held at Khabarovsk, a city of about 643,000 people, located 30 miles north of the border. Chinese nationals with money come up there, inspect Russian enterprises, and decide whether or not to lend money. For now, these Chinese workers in the Russian Far East are there on guest visas, but there is no guarantee that temporary status will continue forever. Russia has not been able to solve the migration and labor issues among its people in the region. Already, Chinese property developers are building more apartment units in the Russian Far East in anticipation that their countrymen will move north for work on a more permanent basis. Because of the increasing commercial activity between Russia and China, more Chinese students have begun studying the Russian language, including in Russian universities. A new elite is forming based on the assumption of greater interconnectivity between the Chinese economy and the Russian Far East. And there are pockets of deeper Chinese influence. In the Jewish autonomous region of the Russian Far East, there is an iron mine built, financed, and staffed exclusively by Chinese nationals that stay there permanently. This mine appears almost as a self-governing entity. There is little regulation by the Russian authorities. The mine awaits connection with the Chinese rail network in the area. Such a connection will come when the first bridge connecting the Russian and Chinese sides of the Amur River is complete. The continuing costs of the war in Ukraine mean that Russia's relative geopolitical power compared to China will get weaker. That means China will be able to exact greater and greater concessions from Russia, and we have already seen a major example. In June 2023, China was granted permission to use Vladivostok as a transit point for its domestic trade flows without paying customs duties to Russia. Russia had hoped to attract Japanese and South Korean investment in its effort to boost Vladivostok, but the war made such partnerships impossible. Now Russia is forced to turn to China for Vladivostok's economic prospects. The symbolism was not lost on Chinese social media users. It was the first time China had access to the port in 163 years. Russia felt that it could no longer exclude the Chinese. Is this a sign of things to come? The prospect of China creating a systematic policy of intrusion in the Russian Far East is a more distant one. For now, taking Taiwan and breaking the containment of the First Island chain occupies top place in Beijing's foreign policy priorities. The Taiwan objective is not only a matter of prestige, but an attempt to secure the country's still much more voluminous maritime trade. Xi is also reported to be personally close with Putin, and this closeness has played a major part in strengthening the strategic partnership. personal relationship may mean that more overt efforts to claim the lost territories will not come to fruition. China appears satisfied with its increasing economic presence there. There is no guarantee that this state of affairs will last forever, though. Xi might intend on remaining China's de facto emperor for life, but he will eventually be out of power. A future Chinese leader might even be more revanchist than Xi is. What if the old issues of the Qing dynasty come up then? Apart from incorporating Taiwan back into the mainland, China's other priority has been the recreation of the old Silk Road network that established its central place in the world's trade balance. This network was disrupted and dissolved after Europeans discovered the Americas and started to make direct sailing voyages to Asia. Economic power flowed westward as a result. China has aimed to bring that power back east, but its Belt and Road initiative has run into many problems. Aside from unsustainable debt, one of these problems is that there are simply too many players along the road from Asia to Europe, and the many territories it must traverse cannot be kept safe from terrorists, let alone the US military. The route between the Russian Far East and Europe, though, only involves one player. As the failures of the Belt and Road projects along the most used route of the old Silk Road begin to balloon and threaten the broader Chinese economy, China will be more pressured to find alternatives. The lost territories in the present Russian Far East could prove more tempting then. The Russian concession to China in Vladivostok might be the first of many. China might not aim for a Taiwan-style reincorporation of this lost territory. Nevertheless, the increased business with Chinese nationals and the region's dependence on Chinese labor and money mean that Beijing will have a growing influence in the territories that were once its own. Do not be surprised if one day, maybe after Xi is out of power, China asserts the need to protect its people in the Russian Far East from prejudicial treatment by some of the local authorities and inhabitants. By invading Ukraine, Russia cut itself off from the West. For Putin, this was fine, as he hoped to present a united front with China against the West. But when one lacks options, one's negotiating position becomes weaker. And when you have something that a former enemy of yours still wants, you need to be careful when you try to make that enemy a friend. What do you think the future of the Russian Far East will look like? Will Russia have challenges holding on to its almost empty wilderness in the face of a much larger Chinese population that appears ready and eager to exploit the opportunities its vast resources have to offer? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out why Russia and China will be at war by this year, or click this other video instead.